Okay, awesome. Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, colleagues, friends. I'm very grateful to be able to contribute to this very important conference. Please let me know if you can't hear me properly, but I'm assuming it all works. Unfortunately, I can't be with you in person, but it's a joy to be able to join in this manner and to have listened all day and now to present live, at least. I'm actually glad that my presentation follows now on the previous presentation, because it's also related to contextual Bible study. I will come to that. The issue of land may seem a bit odd in the program of this conference. The issue of land, more specifically of land dispossession, and with that of ownership, reform and restitution, has affected and disrupted the lives of countless people in South Africa, starting a long time ago and continuing until today, being undeniably intertwined with issues like poverty, violence and inequality. In the Judy Simelane Memorial Lecture last year, 2021, Prof. Zetu Matebeni argues that colonialism, by raping the land, caused thinking that you have the power to take something that's not yours to become the norm in South African society. And colonialism is thus intrinsically linked to current day violence and rape. And with that, she goes to the heart of the land issue in showing how everything intersects, and that it didn't start with the Groups Areas Act or Natives Land Act. And also showing that this topic is incredibly complex, and I will only address a fraction even of my abstract. This paper reflects in a sense the starting point for my PhD research, and I will focus on a contemporary and a biblical story about land, exploring how the voices of the landless are voices of truth, are theology, and speak to theology, and how they in a sense become queer prophets, queer in the sense of non-ordinary. And in that sense, this issue, this topic of land, I think actually fits well in this conference program, especially, as I said, following on the contextual Bible study paper we just listened to. I want to start by telling you a story. If you take a drive from Oudtshoorn on the R328 past the Kango Caves, and if you continue on that road about 25 kilometers out of town, you will spot a building with a badge on the wall proclaiming it to be the Grootkraal Primary School. On Sundays, this school building functions as a church. And the property on which this building is situated is a small portion of the farm Grootkraal, which extends from the road up into the foothills of the Swartberg. And there's an impoverished Black community of farm workers, artisans, domestic workers, and people working in various capacities at the Kango Caves connected to this very building, to this small piece of land. The very fiber and identity of this Grootkraal community centers on the property where church services, schooling, and a host of events regularly take place. One could say it holds the collective soul of an otherwise dispersed population. And for over 200 years, this community has been using this small portion of the farm properties for their communal activities. For all of those years, they've lived in harmony with the white land and farm owners. But however, when the farm in 2010 is sold to a business trust by public auction, the trust launches an eviction application against the school on the farm. The business trust wishes to demolish the building and use the land for a game reserve. We need this land, they say. The school and community center can just go somewhere else. They even have a suggestion to move all the children that go to school there and move them 20 kilometers further. The fact that evicting the school and church would effectively result in breaking up the community too seems irrelevant. Now I want to pause here for a moment and swift focus to another story about a piece of land. We find it in the Bible in 1 Kings 21, the story of Naboth and his vineyard. In this story, we encounter King Ahab confiscating Naboth's vineyard. As expressed ideally in the laws of the Hebrew Bible, the only transference of property in ancient Israel should be through inheritance. And while there is some evidence that the inalienability of property was current in monarchical times, there can be little doubt that the very emergence of the monarchy and the growth of the cities led to sweeping sociological changes as far as land ownership was concerned. Many small farmers were forced to sell their farms to a new landed aristocracy. As the king and political elite, Ahab owned plenty of land of his own. But he wants more land than he already has, claiming that he wants to use Naboth's vineyard for a vegetable garden. He wants to buy it or trade it for another piece of land. Just go somewhere else. Naboth, however, refuses, saying, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors," referring to the laws he lives by. But nothing appears to stop Ahab with the help of Queen Jezebel from dispossessing Naboth of his vineyard. Naboth is falsely accused of blasphemy and put to death, and Ahab gets the vineyard. This land grab does not go without punishment. The injustice of dispossessing Naboth of his land leads, after all, to a confrontation between the prophet Elijah and Ahab. However, Naboth is still dead, and the text in question seems to fail to redress the problem of socio-economic injustice. Not much of a liberating message, so it seems, just a traumatic story for all involved. Now back to the Grootkraal community. Some of the community members, parents, grandparents, and it should be noted it was mostly mothers and grandmothers, read the story of Naboth together when facing eviction from the farm. In fact, this situation at that time had become a long, drawn-out process without much perspective. They read the story of Naboth using the method of contextual Bible study that Charlene and colleagues just spoke about. And they recognized the soul of their community in Naboth's story. Some of them had heard the story before, some of them never encountered it before. And for all, it was a new conversation partner in this issue. And even though the text itself doesn't show signs of socio-economic justice through redistribution or anything like that. The story does seem to have an empowering effect for this community. They joined forces with Lawyers for Human Rights and lodged a counterclaim against the eviction application of the business trust. They organized protests outside the Western Cape High Court and let their voices be heard, not only against the business trust, but against a system making this very case happen in the first place. And they were saying, we've worked all our lives, but we are still an impoverished community where substance abuse amongst youth is ever growing. But we are a community. And we know that South African law didn't allow us in the past to own this land, but it is our land. We've occupied it, we've used it, we've lived on it for as long as we can remember. This is the land of our forefathers and mothers, and we will not give it up. Now, in Naboth's case, there's no community, at least it doesn't appear in the story, that joins forces on his behalf. And there's no court case, except one could say for the one with false charges against Naboth. There's a deafening silence when it comes to the people of the city, except when they speak their false accusers. For the people of the Grootkraal community, however, the voice of Naboth was not silenced. Even though he speaks only one sentence, the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors, and he seems to disappear from the story as a vocal individual after that. But this is still what empowers the community members in saying, well, we are not dead yet. We can still stand up and let our voices be heard. Perhaps even on behalf of Naboth and all others whose voices have been silenced, but they are not silent. Now, in conversation with some of the community members that read the story of Naboth, it became clear to me that the land for this Grootkraal community is not in the first place for them to farm on and thus economically relevant, providing directly their livelihoods, even though the idea of land turns out to be inextricably connected to that. First of all, however, this tiny piece of land is the soul of their community. This land can be trusted to sustain life, to sustain relationships with things as well as with people, and to sustain future too. There's 160 children receiving education on exactly that tiny piece of land. Just going somewhere else would mean dropout for many of these children. Furthermore, in loss of land, so it turned out, there would be loss of identity. The imminent loss of land is experienced by the community as a refusal of the other to recognize the very existence of the community. Land ownership for the community members does not mean possession, but ensuring an ongoing relationship with each other, with the land, and even with God as Lord of the land. Land is seen as a gift and corresponds with hospitality and sharing, contrary to hostility and privatization. And this reminds of Brueggemann's reflection on land as the central theme of the biblical faith, connected to a sense of place, of rootedness, and of identity. And it also reminds of the image Brueggemann paints of land as a prism through which one can perceive other aspects of faith. Now, land for the Grootkraal community is indeed like a prism through which faith, but even life in general, are perceived. for this community, this is their truth. The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors. Naboth's truth, the inheritance of my ancestors, meaning much more to them than owning this piece of land or having the right to use it, referring to a wholeness of joy and well-being. At the same time, the community members recognize ambiguity in the story of Naboth, as well as in their own story and in the broader society of South Africa, asking questions like, who is victim and who is perpetrator? Pointing out the major role of the system in all of this, and the issue of power and of different worldviews. Now, having connected these two stories about land, I want to ask, what do the experiences and the stories of this Grootkraal community mean to and for theology? Specifically for a theology of land. How do they become more than just stories that resonate with the stories of the Hebrew Bible, with the story of Naboth specifically? How does this become more than a once-off activity of reading the story of Naboth and connecting it to their own context? There are so many communities and so many families in South Africa with their very own stories, very similar or very, very different to that of the Grootkraal community, all within specific contexts, rural, urban, but grounded in a collective trauma of land loss and everything that intersects with it. Rezana writes that the theological task when addressing the land issue in South Africa is primarily to return to the biblical exposition about the land. Top of the list should be the willing or the voluntary steps towards land restoration, so he says. And with the Grootkraal community in mind, and also the knowledge that that there's many more stories that need to be explored and studied extensively, I want to add that at the same time as returning to the biblical exposition about the land, we, as theologians, professional interpreters primarily, should turn to the voices of these traumatized people, the landless in this case. Because it is necessity for a credible theology of land, a theology that will have power to disrupt theological as well as political discourse, that the voices of the landless speak to theology, even are recognized as theology. The conversations amongst the community members in Grootkraal in response to the text show that, well, ordinary people, marginalized communities, in fact, one could say neglected by mainstream biblical studies, engaging the text contextually may play a vital role in forming a theology of land. And I'm thinking of Gerald West writing how our discourse has excluded others, particularly those who might disrupt and challenge the established hierarchies of our academies and societies. And Helen John, amongst others, substantiates this argument by focusing on foregrounding what she calls contextual grassroots voices, indeed queer voices, I'd say. The non-ordinary voices in diverse cultural context, foregrounding them for the interpretive benefits that they offer the Biblical Studies Academy, Western, African, or otherwise. Now there's an ongoing debate whether or not ordinary people could or should be called theologians. Some say that every reflection on faith is a theology, Others argue that only academic theology, theology done in the academy, is theology, and that other reflections of faith are rather called lived religion. Shouldn't we, and by we I mean all of us, but especially theologians, academics, and not just in South Africa, and not in least in Europe as well, shouldn't we be even bolder and state that a theology that does not recognize the ability and authority of ordinary believers, traumatized by land loss in many ways, recognize them as creative, not so ordinary, contextual biblical theologians. A theology that does not recognize ordinary believers as contextual biblical theologians, a theology that does not recognize this and does not work together to create a contextual theology of land, shouldn't we state that that is a theology that enriches only the elite? Well, how then may these contextual grassroots voices speaking of land and land loss and understanding and meaning of land contribute to a theology of land? How may they inform, nuance, and challenge biblical theology? The focus should indeed be foregrounding these voices, and dialogue and narratives can be central to such a theology. Theology, after all, is a common task, as Moltmann has argued. And there's truth to be found in unhindered dialogue. In other words, a theology of land must not only be a theology for, but of and with the people. In this case, for, of, and with the voices of the landless that speak from the truth of their experiences, that may disrupt our academic and ecclesiastical theology, speaking to social structures, to the system, and to other contexts as well. Now, to conclude, for now, I want to ask, is Naboth's story liberating for those struggling with landlessness and everything it intersects with in South Africa? Perhaps it is. Perhaps it's not. Perhaps it's an indictment to the system, to those in power. All sorts of power. An indictment both then and now. But at least it contains truth that has the power to disrupt, so it seems, for the Grootgrauw community. Reading the biblical text and viewing their trauma in a different way, receiving words, a framework, a story to help voice their own experience. And for them it results eventually in having the final judgment in their case rule in their favor. And I quote from the final judgment, "The community will be able to continue exercising their land rights, including the operation of the school and the church, freely in perpetuity and without interference of the present or successive landowners." End quote. This ruling leaves many questions unanswered, and there's many more stories to be told. At the same time, all of this leaves a great task for theology, bringing diverse voices into the interpretive conversation around land and theology. Thank you very much for your attention.